Maggie had always been a woman of resilience, a trait she developed long before she met John. They had been married for 30 years, and when he was diagnosed with a spinal injury, leaving him paraplegic, Maggie's life as she knew it had been altered forever. What once was a bustling house filled with laughter and adventure now became a quiet home, where the sounds of the television and the soft clink of Maggie's footsteps as she moved about became the rhythm of their lives. For the past 23 years, Maggie had cared for John. She fed him, bathed him, helped him get dressed, and made sure he never felt alone in his wheelchair. Their love had once been passionate, but now it was quiet, like the still waters of a calm lake. She didn't mind, though. She had always believed in the power of loyalty and love. In sickness and in health, she had vowed, and she kept her promise. But there was a feeling growing inside of her, a gnawing suspicion she couldn't quite shake. Maggie wasn't stupid. She knew something was off. For months now, John had been distant, his once bright eyes dimming with something Maggie couldn't identify. Every time she asked if anything was wrong, he would smile that weak, familiar smile, and tell her, "It's nothing, dear. Just tired." Maggie had no reason to doubt him. She had cared for him with all her heart, and he had never given her a reason to think otherwise. But the whispers of the mind are a tricky thing, and sometimes they grow louder than reason. It all started one night when Maggie went to bed early, exhausted from a long day of taking care of John, when she heard it. A voice, low, hushed, almost soothing. At first, she thought it was just the television. But no, the voice was too clear. Maggie lay still in the dark, her breath shallow as she strained her ears to hear. It was coming from the living room, where John's wheelchair had been parked. The voice was familiar, but not his. She tiptoed to the door, her heart pounding in her chest. Peering through the crack, she saw him, John, on the phone, his voice low and secretive. And then, there she was. The neighbor, Susan. Maggie's stomach twisted in knots. John had always spoken fondly of Susan. She was a good woman, someone who helped when Maggie couldn't, a friendly neighbor who had a gentle touch. But tonight, it was different. The way John was speaking to her, it wasn't the tone of a man talking to a friend. Maggie felt something cold run through her veins. She couldn't quite place it, but there was something in the way Susan laughed, in the way John responded, that made Maggie's heart sink. It was as if they shared a secret, something Maggie wasn't a part of. Something more than friendship. Her mind raced. Was it possible? Could John, after all these years of devotion and love, be hiding something from her? It was hard to believe. After all, they had been through so much together. But the evidence was right in front of her. For days, Maggie tried to brush it off. She tried to convince herself it was nothing. John was just lonely, she told herself. He needed someone to talk to. But the thought gnawed at her like a disease, eating away at the trust she had built with him over the years. Then, a week later, Maggie made a decision. She was going to find out the truth. There was no way around it. She had to confront him. The confrontation was inevitable, but Maggie never expected it to happen the way it did. One morning, she stood in the kitchen, preparing John's breakfast, when she heard his wheelchair roll across the floor. The air in the room seemed to thicken as he entered the kitchen, his eyes meeting hers with a glint of something she hadn't seen in years. Guilt. Maggie took a deep breath, her hands trembling as she set the frying pan down. She couldn't ignore it anymore. "John," she said, her voice steady but full of emotion. "I need to know something." He froze, his hand resting on the edge of the counter, his face paling. Maggie could see the beads of sweat forming on his forehead, and her heart broke. "What's going on, John?" Maggie's voice cracked, but she didn't care. "What are you hiding from me?" For a long moment, there was only silence. The ticking of the clock on the wall seemed to echo louder than anything. Then, slowly, John turned to face her, his eyes filled with regret. "Maggie, I didn't want you to find out like this," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "I've been talking to Susan. I didn't mean for it to happen, but..." His voice faltered, and Maggie felt her world shattering before her. He didn't even finish the sentence. Maggie didn't need to hear more. She already knew. Susan, the woman who had been in their lives for years. The woman whom Maggie had trusted. the woman who had become a confidant to John in ways Maggie never had. "Why John?" Maggie whispered, her chest tightening with a mix of pain and anger. "Why her?" John took a deep breath, his gaze lowering to the floor. "I don't know. I'm sorry, Maggie. I was lonely. I didn't want to burden you with my feelings. You've given me everything, but I wasn't enough for you. And that was it." The words hung in the air like an unspoken truth. Maggie felt a tear slip down her cheek. This wasn't the man she had known. This wasn't the man she had cared for all these years. But as she looked at him, broken and regretful, Maggie realized something important. This wasn't just about betrayal. This wasn't just about Susan or the affair. This was about something deeper, something they both had ignored for too long. And as the silence settled between them, Maggie knew this was just the beginning. There were more secrets, more pain to uncover. But she would face it, one way or another. Maggie sat at the kitchen table, her hands trembling around her teacup as John's words echoed in her mind. She had never imagined this day would come. Not after all the years they had spent together, not after the vows they had made in sickness and in health. Yet here she was, staring at the man she thought she knew, but now was uncertain of. John's face was pale, his eyes a mix of guilt and sorrow. For a moment, there was silence between them, thick and suffocating. Maggie's mind raced. She wanted to scream, to accuse him, to demand answers for every little lie that had slipped through the cracks. But she didn't. She stayed still, her heart pounding, her emotions swirling inside her like a storm. "Why did you do it, John?" Maggie whispered, her voice barely audible. "Why Susan?" John opened his mouth to speak, but then paused. It was as if the weight of his actions had crushed any words he might have said. He sank into a chair across from her, rubbing his temples. "I don't know, Maggie. I don't know." His voice trailed off, defeated. "It just happened. You were always so busy with me, with everything I needed, and Susan, she was there. She listened. She made me feel wanted again." His words hung in the air, raw and painful. "I never meant to hurt you. I thought maybe if I just had someone to talk to, I could get through it. But I was wrong. I never should have." Maggie looked at him, her heart heavy with betrayal. She had cared for him, devoted her life to him in ways she had never imagined for herself. He was her world. But now, it felt like she was losing him in ways that couldn't be undone. And it wasn't just Susan. It was the years of emotional distance, of unmet needs, of things left unsaid between them. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she didn't allow them to fall. Instead, she stood up, pacing the room, her mind a whirlwind of anger, hurt, and confusion. "You couldn't talk to me, John? After all these years, you couldn't tell me how you were feeling?" John's eyes flickered with shame. "I didn't want to burden you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've always been so strong. I thought I could handle it myself, but I couldn't. And now look at what I've done." Maggie's chest tightened. She didn't know if it was the years of caring for him, the years of loving him despite his injury, or the overwhelming sense of betrayal. But in that moment, she felt a rage build inside her like nothing she'd ever felt before. This wasn't just about Susan. It wasn't about the betrayal. It was about the years they had spent in silence, the years they had ignored their own needs, their own pain. "I don't know what to say to you, John. I don't know what to do," Maggie admitted, her voice cracking. "I feel like I've lost you, but at the same time, I don't even know who you are anymore. You've been so distant, so cold, and now this. I don't know how to fix this." John's eyes filled with regret. "Maggie, I swear, I never meant to hurt you. I never wanted to betray you. I was just so lonely. You've been my everything, but I wasn't enough for you, for us." Maggie's heart shattered as she looked at him, sitting there, broken. She realized then that he wasn't just confessing his guilt. He was confessing his own fears, his own insecurities. He had felt abandoned in his own way. But still, the weight of the secret of everything he had kept from her was too much to bear. She didn't know how long they sat there in silence, but when Maggie finally spoke again, her voice was steady. I need some time, John. I need space to think. I don't know if I can forgive you for this, but I don't know if I can walk away either. John nodded slowly, tears slipping down his cheeks. I understand. I'll give you all the time you need. Maggie stepped outside, the air cool and crisp against her skin. The street was quiet, the sun beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the neighborhood. The same neighborhood where she had spent most of her life, where she had raised children, where she had cared for John. It was the same, but everything felt different now. She walked to the small bench in the garden, the place where she had sat with John many years ago, watching the stars together. The memories flooded her, the laughter, the quiet moments of peace. She couldn't believe it had come to this. All those years of devotion, now tainted by a secret she couldn't escape. But as she sat there, her thoughts scattered, Maggie realized something. She couldn't keep holding onto the pain. She couldn't keep reliving the betrayal, the hurt. If she wanted to move forward, if she wanted to rebuild anything with John, she needed to understand what had happened, why it had happened. And she needed to forgive, not just John, but herself too. For the first time in days, she took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the situation slowly lift. It wasn't going to be easy. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with twists and turns she couldn't predict. But Maggie knew one thing: she couldn't let anger and resentment define her anymore. She had to let go. Meanwhile, across the street, Susan sat in her living room, nervously glancing out the window toward John's house. She had no idea what had transpired between the couple. She didn't know if John had told Maggie the truth, if he had confessed to everything. But one thing was clear: her life was about to change. The secret she had helped keep from Maggie, the secret she had shared with John, was no longer something she could hide from. The days following Maggie's conversation with John were filled with a heavy silence. The house felt like a mausoleum, its walls closing in as the weight of their unspoken words pressed down on them. John spent most of his time in his wheelchair, gazing out of the window, his thoughts tangled with regret and guilt. Maggie, on the other hand, kept busy, as she always did, cleaning, organizing, doing anything she could to avoid confronting the reality of their situation. She couldn't keep pretending like everything was fine, though. The memories of their past, of laughter, shared secrets, and quiet evenings together kept creeping into her mind, making the present feel even more unbearable. How could she look at him the same way? How could she erase the image of him talking to Susan in the dead of night, whispering words meant only for her? Maggie needed answers. No more avoiding it. She had to confront Susan. The day Maggie decided to visit Susan, she didn't tell John. She just slipped on her coat, walked out the door, and drove across town, her hands gripping the steering wheel tighter with each mile. Her mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. What would Susan say? What would she do? Would she apologize? Or would she deny everything, pretend nothing ever happened? When Maggie arrived at Susan's house, she didn't knock. She just opened the door, feeling an inexplicable surge of courage. The smell of fresh coffee and cookies wafted through the air, and for a moment, it felt like nothing had changed. But Maggie knew better. Everything had changed. Susan was sitting in the kitchen, her back to the door, humming softly as she wiped down a counter. She didn't notice Maggie until she cleared her throat. Susan spun around, her eyes widening in surprise. Her usual smile faltered when she saw Maggie standing there, her expression cold, her eyes fierce. "Maggie," Susan said, her voice unsteady. What are you doing here?" Maggie didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I need to talk to you." "Now." Susan's face paled. She set the towel down slowly, as if it might shatter if she moved too quickly. "Maggie, I didn't want you to find out like this." "Then why didn't you tell me the truth?" Maggie's voice cracked, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Why didn't you tell me about the secret you and John were keeping from me?" Susan opened her mouth, but no words came out. Maggie could see the struggle in her eyes. She was afraid. Afraid of what Maggie might say, of what she might do. "I never meant for things to go this far," Susan said finally, her voice trembling. "It just happened." John and we've been talking for months, but it was never supposed to be more than that. It was never meant to hurt you, Maggie. I swear." Maggie took a deep breath, trying to contain the anger rising inside her. "You think I'm an idiot, Susan? You think I didn't notice? You were flirting with him behind my back. You knew what you were doing." Susan's eyes filled with tears. "I never meant to hurt you. It wasn't about that. John, he needed someone. And I guess I needed someone too." The words stung more than Maggie expected. Susan's confession wasn't about love or even attraction. It was about loneliness. It was about two people who had been overlooked in their own ways. Susan, craving attention after years of marriage, and John, trapped in a life where his body had betrayed him. Maggie's heart softened, just for a moment. She saw the same sadness in Susan's eyes that she had seen in John's. But that didn't excuse the betrayal. It didn't make it right. "You should have come to me," Maggie said, her voice quieter now, almost pleading. "You should have told me. We could have talked about it. I could have been there for you. But you went behind my back." Susan nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I know. And I'm sorry, Maggie. I've been selfish. I didn't think about how it would affect you. I didn't think about anything but myself." Maggie looked at her for a long moment, trying to process the words, trying to make sense of everything. She wanted to scream, to lash out. But in that moment, she realized that Susan wasn't the enemy. She wasn't the one who had broken their marriage. No, that responsibility belonged to John and to Maggie too. She had been so focused on John's betrayal that she had never stopped to ask why they had drifted apart in the first place. Maggie had buried herself in the role of caretaker, forgetting about her own needs, her own desires. She had neglected the one person who had been with her through thick and thin. And John? He had been too proud to ask for help, too afraid to admit his loneliness. He had reached out to Susan because she was there, because she didn't judge him, because she made him feel like a man again. But at what cost? "Thank you for being honest with me," Maggie said softly, her voice tinged with resignation. "But I can't keep doing this. I can't keep pretending like nothing happened." Susan nodded, wiping her eyes. "I understand. I'm so sorry, Maggie. I never wanted to come between you two." Maggie gave her one last look before turning to leave. She wasn't angry anymore. She wasn't filled with rage or vengeance. She was tired. Tired of carrying the weight of this pain, tired of holding onto the anger. It wasn't helping anyone. As Maggie walked out the door, she realized something important. She didn't need to fix everything right now. She didn't need to have all the answers. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but she would get through it. One step at a time. Back at home, John was waiting for her, his wheelchair positioned by the window. When Maggie walked in, his eyes immediately met hers. There was no anger in his gaze, just an overwhelming sense of guilt and fear. "I talked to her," Maggie said, her voice steady. "I know everything, John." He nodded slowly, his eyes filled with pain. "I'm sorry, Maggie. I never meant to hurt you." Maggie didn't know what to say. There was so much left unsaid between them. But in that moment, she realized something. Forgiveness wasn't about absolving someone of their mistakes. It was about letting go of the weight of those mistakes, about choosing to move forward. "I don't know what's going to happen," Maggie said quietly, taking a deep breath. "But I think I need some time to figure things out." John didn't argue. He simply nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. For the first time in a long time, Maggie felt a sense of clarity. There was no quick fix, no easy solution. But at least now, they both knew the truth. Days turned into weeks, and the house remained in a heavy silence. Maggie and John had both retreated into their own worlds. John spent most of his time in his wheelchair, staring out the window, as if waiting for anything to change. Maggie, on the other hand, buried herself in the routine of daily life, yet her mind never stopped racing. She cleaned, she cooked, she did everything she could to keep herself busy, but she couldn't escape the truth. The betrayal was there, hanging in the air like a dark cloud. But somehow, despite the pain, Maggie began to realize that this wasn't just about John's affair with Susan. This was about her, about who she had become over the years. It was about the years she had spent caring for John, neglecting her own needs, her own desires in the process. The woman she had once been, the passionate, independent Maggie, was lost somewhere between the years of care and responsibility. She had forgotten what it felt like to live for herself. One evening, after a particularly long day, Maggie found herself standing in front of the mirror, staring at her reflection. She didn't recognize the woman looking back at her. Her eyes were tired, her face drawn with the weight of so many years of sacrifice. She had given everything for John, for their life together, but somewhere along the way, she had forgotten who she was outside of that role. As Maggie gazed at herself, a strange realization hit her. She had been living for everyone else, her children, her husband, the people around her, never stopping to think about her own happiness. She had been so focused on being the perfect wife, the perfect caretaker, that she had lost sight of what it meant to be Maggie. The thought terrified her, but it also sparked something inside her. Maybe, just maybe, it was time for her to take control of her own life again. It wasn't about leaving John or finding someone else. It was about rediscovering herself. It was about healing. The next morning, Maggie took a step she never thought she would take. She signed up for a painting class. It wasn't much, but it was a start. For years, she had put aside her passion for art, telling herself that there was no time, that there were more important things to do. But now, with the weight of the world on her shoulders, she realized that she needed something to hold on to. Something that was just hers. John, as usual, didn't ask many questions. He had been withdrawn, his own mind consumed with guilt. But when Maggie came home after her first class, she couldn't help but smile. For the first time in a long while, she felt something stir inside her, a sense of purpose, a spark of life. "How was it?" John asked, his voice soft but tentative. Maggie's smile was faint but genuine. "It was good, really good. I think I need to do more of this." John didn't say anything at first. He just nodded, his expression unreadable. He had always known Maggie's love for painting, but he had never fully understood it. The more time passed, the more he realized how much he had taken her for granted. He had become so fixated on his own pain, his own loneliness, that he had failed to see the woman who had been standing beside him all along. Days went by, and Maggie continued to take her painting classes, slowly finding solace in the colors and brushstrokes. She poured her emotions into the canvas, anger, sadness, hope, and with each painting, she felt a little lighter. She began to remember who she was before all the years of caretaking, before the betrayal, before the pain. But even as she found herself again, the tension between her and John lingered. They spoke less and less, and when they did, it was awkward, the weight of their history pressing down on every word. Maggie wanted to forgive him, to move past the hurt, but she didn't know how. How could she forgive him for the years of emotional neglect? How could she forgive him for the lies, for the secrecy? One afternoon, as Maggie was putting the finishing touches on a painting, John wheeled himself into the room. He watched her for a moment, his eyes filled with emotion. "I never wanted to hurt you," he said quietly. "I know I did, but I never wanted to." Maggie paused, her brush hovering above the canvas. She didn't turn to face him immediately. She needed to collect her thoughts, to find the words that were swirling inside her. "I know," she said softly. "I know you didn't. But it doesn't change the fact that you did. And it doesn't change the fact that I've been living in a way that wasn't healthy for either of us. I've been so focused on taking care of you that I forgot how to take care of myself." John was silent, absorbing her words. "I never wanted you to lose yourself in this, Maggie. I never wanted to be the reason for that." Maggie finally turned to face him, her eyes meeting his. There was still pain, but there was something else there too. Something that hadn't been there in years. It was the beginning of healing. Maybe they couldn't fix everything. Maybe they couldn't go back to what they once were. But Maggie realized that forgiveness didn't mean erasing the past. It meant letting go of the grip it had on her. "I don't know what's going to happen, John," Maggie said quietly, "but I know that I need to keep moving forward. For me. For us. John nodded, understanding. I'll be here, Maggie. I don't expect you to forgive me right away, but I hope that one day we can start again. I'll be patient. I'll wait. Maggie didn't have the answers yet, but for the first time in a long time, she didn't need them. She had taken the first step toward healing, and that was enough. The road ahead would be difficult, but it was a road she was ready to walk. The weeks that followed were marked by a strange tension in the house. The silence between Maggie and John had shifted, no longer heavy with anger, but instead laden with uncertainty. Maggie continued to paint, her art becoming her only refuge from the emotional storm she had been weathering for so long. Her paintings were full of raw emotion, colors colliding in ways that reflected her inner turmoil. Yet, each stroke on the canvas was a step forward, a way to release the pain she had held for so long. John, meanwhile, remained in his wheelchair, his mind spinning in circles. He was lost in a haze of guilt and regret, but he knew he couldn't change the past. Maggie was right, he had been selfish. He had hidden from the truth, from his own feelings, and it had cost him more than he could have ever imagined. He had hurt Maggie, and now he was left with the consequences of his actions. One evening, as the sun began to set, casting a golden light over the room, Maggie sat in the living room, deep in thought. She had been painting all afternoon, but her mind was elsewhere. The house felt colder these days, despite the warmth of the setting sun. John was in the next room, staring out the window as he often did, his expression distant. Maggie knew he was lost in his own thoughts, his guilt eating away at him. She couldn't ignore it anymore. She couldn't pretend like everything was fine. She had to face the truth, even if it hurt. Maggie, John's voice broke through her thoughts, soft but full of emotion. I need to talk to you. Maggie put down her paintbrush and turned to face him, her heart racing. She knew this moment was coming. She had been waiting for it, hoping for it, dreading it. She could feel the weight of his words before he even spoke them. I've been thinking, John began, his voice shaking slightly. I know I've hurt you, and I don't deserve your forgiveness. I don't even know if I deserve your love anymore. But there's something I need to tell you. Maggie's pulse quickened. She didn't know if she was ready for what he was about to say, but she couldn't turn away now. I've been talking to Susan, yes. I won't deny that. But it wasn't just about filling a void. It was more than that. When I lost the use of my legs, I lost myself. I felt like I wasn't a man anymore. I couldn't provide for you the way I used to, and I couldn't be the husband I promised I would be. I thought if I could talk to someone, anyone, I could feel like myself again. But it wasn't Susan. It wasn't anyone else. It was me. I've been running from myself for so long, and it's caught up with me. Maggie listened, her eyes never leaving John's face. She saw the pain in his eyes, the regret that was almost palpable. She had always known he was a proud man, but now, in this moment, he seemed small, vulnerable, and broken. For a fleeting moment, Maggie felt a pang of sympathy for him. But it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to erase the years of hurt, the years of neglect. I thought I could keep pretending everything was fine, John continued, his voice now barely a whisper. I thought if I kept busy, if I stayed quiet, I could make it all go away. But I was wrong. I've been living in a fantasy world, and the truth is, I've hurt you, Maggie. And for that, I am so sorry. Maggie felt her heart tighten, a mixture of anger and sadness bubbling up inside her. She had always loved John, loved him fiercely, but how could she reconcile the man he was now with the man she had once known? She couldn't just sweep everything under the rug, as if it had never happened. Maggie, John whispered, his eyes pleading now. I don't know how to fix this. I don't know if we can ever go back to what we were. But I'm asking you, please, don't give up on me. For the first time in what felt like forever, Maggie allowed herself to look at him, not with resentment or hurt, but with a sense of clarity. She realized that, in a way, they were both broken. They were both struggling to navigate a world that had changed beneath their feet. But could they find their way back to each other? Could they rebuild what had been destroyed? I don't know if I can forgive you yet, John, Maggie said quietly, her voice steady but filled with emotion. I don't know if I can ever forget what happened, but I'm not ready to give up either. Not yet. I need time. We both need time. John nodded, his face softening with relief. I'll wait, Maggie. I'll wait for as long as it takes. Maggie didn't respond right away. She didn't know what the future held, or whether she would ever truly be able to forgive him. But in that moment, she realized that forgiveness wasn't just about letting go of the past. It was about choosing to move forward, one step at a time. Later that night, as Maggie lay in bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between her and John. The weight of the years had not been lifted, but the possibility of healing was there, just beyond the horizon. She had taken a step toward reclaiming herself, toward finding her own peace, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of hope. The days that followed were a mixture of stillness and movement. Maggie and John had reached a strange understanding between them, but it wasn't enough to bridge the gap that had formed over the years. They spent most of their time in silence, lost in their own thoughts, but it wasn't the same suffocating silence that had marked their marriage before. It was different now, more reflective, filled with the weight of unspoken words and emotions too raw to touch. Maggie's paintings continued to flourish, each canvas an outpouring of the confusion and turmoil inside her. She began to feel like she was discovering a part of herself she had long since buried. In the colors and strokes, she found a form of therapy, a way to process her pain. And for the first time in years, she felt a sense of control over her emotions, control over her life. But despite the small victories in her personal journey, there was still the shadow of John's betrayal hanging over them both. It was a constant reminder that things could never go back to what they had been. Trust had been shattered, and no amount of apologies or promises could mend it immediately. John, too, was grappling with his own emotions. He had spent so long hiding behind his own guilt and pride, but now, facing the reality of his actions, he felt as though he was drowning. The truth had set him free in some ways, but it had also left him feeling more isolated than ever. He had opened his heart to Maggie, but now he had to wait for her to decide whether or not she could open hers to him. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a soft orange glow across the room, Maggie found herself sitting on the porch, staring out into the distance. She was lost in her thoughts when she heard the creak of the door behind her. It was John, wheeling himself slowly onto the porch, his face lined with exhaustion. He didn't say anything at first, just sat there beside her in silence. Maggie didn't mind. Sometimes, silence was the only thing that could bridge the gap between them. I've been thinking, John said, his voice barely above a whisper. About us. About everything. Maggie turned to look at him, her expression unreadable. She had heard those words before. They were always followed by promises, apologies, and endless attempts to fix what couldn't be fixed. But this time, something felt different. Maybe it was because she had finally started to let go of the need to make everything perfect. Maybe it was because, for once, she wasn't waiting for him to fix her. I know I've hurt you, John continued, his voice strained. I know I've betrayed you in ways that I can never take back. But I need you to understand something. I never meant to hurt you, Maggie. I've been running from myself for so long that I couldn't see what was right in front of me. You. Maggie didn't answer immediately. She stared ahead, feeling the weight of his words. She had heard them before, but somehow they felt different now. More honest. More raw. She realized that, despite the hurt, despite the betrayal, there was still something there. Something that had been buried beneath the years of neglect and pain. I don't know what the future holds, Maggie said softly, her voice steady but tinged with uncertainty. But I know that I can't keep living in the past. I've spent too many years stuck there, and I don't want to spend the rest of my life holding onto the anger and resentment. John turned to her, his eyes searching hers. "I'll do whatever it takes, Maggie. I'll be patient. I'll wait for you. But please, don't shut me out. I don't want to lose you." For a moment, Maggie was silent. She felt the weight of his words, but she also felt the weight of her own emotions. The anger, the betrayal, the pain, it was all still there, simmering beneath the surface. But she realized that she couldn't keep carrying it with her. She couldn't keep letting it define her. "I'm not shutting you out, John," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I just need time. Time to figure out who I am, what I want. Time to forgive, not just you, but myself." John nodded, understanding. He didn't push her. He didn't try to make her feel guilty for taking her time. He simply sat there, beside her, in the quiet of the evening, knowing that it would take time for the pieces of their lives to come back together. And that was okay. As the night fell and the stars began to twinkle above them, Maggie and John sat in silence, the weight of the past still heavy, but no longer overwhelming. There was something new between them now, an understanding, a glimmer of hope that, despite everything, they could find a way forward. Time passed slowly, yet in its passing, something began to shift. Maggie and John weren't completely healed, but they were beginning to learn how to navigate the difficult path toward redemption. Every day was an effort, a conscious decision to take one step forward, even when the weight of their past was heavy on their shoulders. Maggie, once consumed by the need to paint her emotions out, found herself slowly pulling away from the canvas. It was as if, in her heart, she no longer needed to pour every ounce of pain and confusion into her art. The need to express her anger had faded, and what replaced it was an unexpected sense of peace. She had spent years creating her own prison through her anger and resentment, but now she was finding it easier to simply exist, without the constant need to be angry, without the need to prove anything to herself or anyone else. John, on the other hand, had started going to therapy. For years, he had avoided confronting the emotional wounds that ran deeper than the paralysis that had taken his legs. He had buried his guilt and shame beneath the mask of pride and bravado, but now he had no choice but to face them. Each session was excruciating, forcing him to confront the hurt he had caused Maggie and to finally acknowledge the insecurities that had driven him to seek comfort elsewhere. It wasn't easy for him. But slowly, John began to understand that healing didn't come from simply asking for forgiveness. It came from truly understanding the damage done and learning to take responsibility for it. Some nights, John would sit in his wheelchair by the window, gazing out at the stars, lost in thought. Maggie, too, would find herself awake in the quiet hours of the night, wondering about the future. There were still so many unanswered questions. Would they ever fully heal? Would the trust be restored between them? Could they ever really move on from the past, or was the damage too deep? One evening, after weeks of slow progress, Maggie received an unexpected phone call. It was from Susan, the neighbor, the woman who had unknowingly played a part in Maggie's pain. The woman who had listened to John's frustrations and had been a temporary escape for him. Maggie had never really considered talking to her. After all, what would there be to say? But something in her gut told her that now was the time. She picked up the phone, and before the conversation even started, Susan spoke first. "Maggie, I know we haven't spoken since everything. But I wanted to reach out and tell you how sorry I am for what happened. For what John did, and for the part one played in it. I never meant to hurt you." The sincerity in Susan's voice was impossible to ignore. Maggie had no idea what to say at first. She hadn't expected this conversation to happen. Her mind raced, trying to process everything. Susan had been a friend, and though she hadn't known it at the time, she had been a crutch for John during a period of weakness. But now, as the years had passed, Susan had her own regrets. "I never wanted to be the one who came between you two," Susan continued. "I should have seen the signs, Maggie. I should have known better than to let things go as far as they did. I'm so sorry." Maggie let out a long breath, her emotions stirring as she spoke. Susan, I don't know what to say. I never wanted this to happen either. I never wanted things to go so wrong between us. But at the end of the day, we can't change the past. We just have to figure out how to move forward. Susan was quiet for a moment. I understand, Maggie. And I think you're right. All we can do is try to heal. And if you ever want to talk, or if there's anything I can do to help, I'll be here. The call ended shortly after, leaving Maggie in a whirlwind of emotions. She hadn't expected forgiveness, at least, not this quickly. But the conversation had left her with something unexpected, a sense of closure. She didn't need to carry the weight of Susan's actions with her anymore. It wasn't about Susan or even John anymore. It was about Maggie. She had to decide what she wanted, and what she wanted was peace. The following days felt different. It wasn't a sudden shift, but it was a noticeable one. John was still working on his own journey of redemption, but now there was a new understanding between him and Maggie. No longer was their relationship about blame, guilt, or resentment. Instead, it was about taking the time to rebuild, brick by brick. And that was all they could do. Maggie woke up one morning, the light of the sun gently creeping through the curtains, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of calm. She didn't have all the answers, and she didn't know what the future would bring. But she was finally beginning to believe in the possibility of healing. Not just for John, but for herself. She didn't need to hold on to the past anymore. She could let go. One afternoon, after a long day of painting, Maggie sat down beside John on the porch. He was staring out into the horizon, his mind far away, but as she approached, he turned to her, a tentative smile playing at the corners of his lips. "I'm sorry, Maggie," he said softly, the weight of his words sinking in. "For everything. For all the pain I caused you." Maggie reached out, her fingers gently brushing his hand. "John," she said, her voice steady. "You don't need to apologize anymore. We've both been through a lot. But I think we're finally starting to understand that it's not about who is right or wrong. It's about learning to live with what we've been given and choosing to move forward." John's smile deepened, and for the first time in a long time, Maggie saw something in his eyes, hope. Not just for their relationship, but for the future. As the sun began to set, they sat in silence, the weight of their past still there, but not overwhelming. There was still much to be done, still many steps to take, but in that moment, they both understood that the journey was worth it. Love, after all, was not about perfection. It was about growth, forgiveness, and the willingness to start over, even when it seemed impossible. The weeks after their quiet conversation on the porch passed in a blur. Time, that ever-unforgiving force, seemed to speed up and slow down all at once. Maggie and John were living in a space of tentative peace, but it wasn't the kind of peace that came from pretending the past hadn't happened. It was a peace that had been hard-earned, a peace that was slowly but steadily taking root. Maggie found herself starting to paint again. It was different this time. Her strokes were no longer filled with rage or confusion. Now, each brushstroke felt like an act of renewal. She painted the landscapes that reminded her of her youth, fields of flowers, sunsets over the lake where she and John had once spent summer days together. Her art became a symbol of rebirth, of starting over. It wasn't about erasing the past. It was about moving forward with the knowledge and wisdom that only came from pain. John, too, began to change. His therapy sessions had become more about healing the emotional wounds he had ignored for so long. The guilt that had haunted him now gave way to something more constructive, accountability. He wasn't looking for forgiveness, but he understood that forgiveness couldn't happen until he truly looked at the damage he'd caused. And so, he worked at it, day by day, step by step, doing what he could to make things right. But the hardest part, the part neither of them was truly ready for, came one fateful morning when Maggie received a letter. It was addressed to both of them, the handwriting unfamiliar. She opened it with trembling hands, the quiet hum of the house around her the only sound. The letter was from a lawyer. The content of the letter was short and direct. John's family, long estranged from him, had decided to contact him after all these years. His father, who had disowned him after the accident, had passed away, and his mother had finally relented. John was named in the will. It wasn't the money or the property that caught Maggie's attention. It was what followed. The letter stated that John had been included in the will, but with one condition: he would have to meet his estranged family in person before anything could be finalized. The weight of it hit Maggie harder than she expected. John's family had been an unknown entity to her, an intimidating presence in the background of their lives, but she knew how much it had hurt him not to be part of their world. This was his chance, a chance to reconcile or to leave the past behind once and for all. Maggie didn't know what to say. She had never been one to push John to confront things he wasn't ready for, but this was different. She had watched him struggle with his own identity for so many years, but now he had the opportunity to step into a new chapter, one where the chains of his past could finally be broken. She turned to John, who had been quietly reading the paper at the kitchen table. The morning light was soft, casting a warm glow on his features, but his eyes were clouded, as they had been ever since the letter had arrived. "They want to see you, John," Maggie said softly, the words hanging in the air. "Your family, they want you to go." John looked up from the paper, his eyes meeting hers. For a moment, he didn't say anything. His hands trembled slightly, the tremors betraying the weight of what he was feeling. He had spent his entire life trying to prove to himself that he didn't need their approval, but the truth was, he had always wanted it. "I don't know if I can do it," John muttered, his voice thick with emotion. "What if they still hate me? What if it's all just a game to them? What if I'm just not strong enough?" Maggie walked over to him, her hand gently resting on his. "John, you've already done the hardest part. You've faced your own demons. This is just one more step. You're not doing it for them. You're doing it for yourself." John looked up at her, his eyes filled with gratitude. She had always known how to say the right thing, how to make him see what he couldn't. She was his anchor, his constant, even after everything they'd been through. "Are you sure?" John asked, his voice full of uncertainty. "I don't want to drag you into this." Maggie smiled softly, her eyes warm with understanding. "You're not dragging me anywhere. We've been through enough together that there's nothing we can't face. You don't have to do it alone." John took a deep breath, as if letting her words settle into his heart. He had been carrying so much for so long, but he knew, in that moment, that he didn't have to carry it alone anymore. It was a small victory, a quiet realization that everything wasn't about the mistakes of the past or the things he'd done wrong. It was about the courage to move forward and the willingness to open himself up to healing. The day they left to meet John's family was one of mixed emotions. Maggie and John had agreed to take it one step at a time, and while she felt nervous for him, she was also filled with hope. Hope that, despite everything that had happened, the past could be put to rest. This could be the beginning of something new. When they arrived at the old family home, it felt like a ghost of the past. The house was grand, filled with memories John had long since buried. As they entered, the family members who had once been so distant were there, waiting. The tension was palpable. But what Maggie and John found in that room was not anger or rejection, but something far more difficult to confront: acceptance. John's mother, though frail, met his eyes with a sorrowful but genuine smile. His brother, who had always resented him, gave him a stiff handshake, but there was no hostility in it. It wasn't warm, but it wasn't cold either. As the meeting wore on, John found himself asking questions he had never thought to ask. His family, who had once rejected him so completely, were now speaking to him like a man, no longer the boy they had abandoned, but someone they had once known and still, in some way, loved. Maggie watched the exchange quietly. She knew that this was the moment John had been waiting for, even if he hadn't known it himself. The closure he needed wasn't about reconciliation. It was about understanding that he didn't need their approval to be whole. He could choose to walk away from the past, leaving it behind him. When the meeting ended, they didn't have answers. But they had something more important, a sense of peace. John knew he didn't have to carry the weight of his family's rejection anymore. And Maggie knew that, together, they could face anything. As they drove home that evening, the sun setting behind them, Maggie reached over and squeezed John's hand. No words were needed. They had come through something together. They had faced the darkness, and now they were walking, slowly but steadily, toward the light.